You have one of the most bold predictions of any guest here, and it's this. In the coming years, the country will undergo a crisis that will fundamentally reset society. Tell us why you see this coming.
Well, that's seen it coming. Yeah, and our dates really haven't changed very much. Bill and I wrote our first book, Generations, back in 1991. Mm-hmm. And that's back when the oldest millennials were about 8 years old.
That's right. And of course, among the things that you're famous for is coining the term the millennial generation.
Yeah, you can blame me.
But getting back to the crisis.
And then 1997, that was the fourth turning. And then most recently, and we always imagined this happening in the mid-2020s to the early 2030s. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that if you look at the long span of American history in particular, but even increasingly countries around the world, you notice that they have these enormous civic transformations born out of conflict that occur about once every long human life. We see that in American history. We had a period of enormous riot and rebellion associated with the Glorious Revolution in the late 17th century. About a lifetime later, we had the American Revolution. A lifetime later, we had the Civil War. A lifetime later, the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II. And a lifetime later, here we are, right? This is driven by generational change. Some generations are really good at creating order and institutional stability out of chaos. Other generations are pretty good at running it down. And we're in the running down phase right now, right? And you can see now increasingly we talk about transformational leaders, we talk about leaders of creative destruction. And the increasing tendency around the world, because around the world we're dealing with leaders who are, senior leaders who are born after World War II. I mean, if you look at, Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping, and you look at all these leaders who were born after World War II, they all tend to be autocratic, ethnocentric autocrats, and they are leading their societies into what I think is conflict. I mean, a grievance-based conflict against, an oppressive world order that is, that they need to resist. But we see this again and again historically. And by the way, because we're on this theme about broad patterns, mm-hmm. roughly halfway in between these civic transformations, when we reorganize what America is constitutionally, politically, our infrastructure, and what we are as a national community, about halfway in between these, we have our great awakenings. Is when we don't so much refashion the external world, we refashion the internal world. Our values, our language, our religion, and many historians, many social historians call the period of the late 60s and 70s America's fourth or fifth Great Awakening, because we number the awakenings. That's a convenient thing in American history. Yeah. You have first Great Awakening, second Great. But depending on when you want to start your first awakening with John Winthrop, back in the 1630s, or with Jonathan Edwards back in the late 1730s, that pattern also follows. So this was a time at which, my generation, young, was tearing down institutions, tearing society apart, regrowing individualism in America, getting rid of the middle class. Boomers hated the middle class. All those pink boxes, all made out of ticky-tacky, they all look just the same. I talked to millennials today, and they say, all these little houses, all pink, and they sound wonderful. Where do we get them? And they're not available. Boomers got rid of them, and we got rid of them in the process of creating a much more unequal society, because boomers think that different strokes for different folks. Everyone should just sort of go their own way. Boomers were uninterested in society as an integral community unit. And it's the rediscovery of community, which is the fundamental function of the conflict. And then let me get this last point, and then you can go on. I know you have a next question.
I have so many questions.
Okay, but the last point is that all sociologists have agreed, since sociology ever started back in the late 19th century with Durkheim and Weber and Tönnies and all these, particularly Germans, they all agreed that community grows out of conflict, us versus them. And we found that again and again in American history. People look back and they see, gee, the late 1940s and 1950s, when we had such a sense of community, everyone trusted the system, everyone left their doors open. Well, you think that had something to do with the fact that they came after a decade and a half of incredible conflict around the world?
And I think that's a great point to turn to what happens next, because as you've written in your two books on the fourth turning, the period we're in now is setting the stage for this upheaval. So what do you predict? You talked about the time frame. At some point, this major upheaval you predict is going to come either this decade or maybe early to mid in the 2030s. What's it going to be? Like, what is the thing? Is it conflict? Is it disruption?
Typically it's one of three things, but it's usually more than one all on top of each other, right? It's great power war, historically. It's political collapse. That is to say, civil war. We've had both great power war and civil war in our history, I should say. And it's market crash, right? Financial crash.
A financial market crash.
Yeah, financial market crash, which is very often triggered by those other two. But of course, it can happen on its own, as certainly it did in 1929. That was, that was from peak to trough. That was nearly 90% decline. I could see that's a market crash. So now that can occur autonomously. That can simply occur simply because the market is extremely overvalued, and it's a chaotic system. So something disturbs it, and it overshoots on the way down, right? That often has happened historically due to tech innovations. The big tech innovation in the 1920s, well, there were several, but the big one probably was radio. If you had invested in RCA, you would have done very, very well in the 1920s. But you would have lost 99% of that value between 1920 and 1933. And you wouldn't have gotten that value back if you had held RCA until 1986. You would have just gotten the value back without inflation when it was finally sold, I think, to GE. Most of the radio firms completely went under. And we see that pattern again and again historically too, right? These huge investment surges, market booms. It does transform our economy. It does transform our society, but not without this huge, boom and bust in the market. That could happen autonomously. And in America, it's never been tied. A market crash has never really been tied to war, partly because every time our big wars break out, Civil War and World War II, markets were undervalued. Markets were undervalued in 1940 and 1941. Although I will say the big market crash that did happen in World War II occurred in May and June of 1940 when the S&P went down by about 35%. And then it went down by about another 15% with Pearl Harbor. Well, that's pretty big, right? Those two together. But it wasn't catastrophic because market values were already depressed by the Depression. You know what I mean? We had already had our collapse, right?
You're talking about tech, though. I think the question on everybody's mind, because for those of us who've been at the session since yesterday, there's a lot of conversation about the disruption of AI. So I think the question is AI going to be the cause of the crisis?
No.
Why?
Well, because, as I say, the big drivers of crisis are political collapse and great power war.
Which I think and another thing on folks' minds is, we're in very unusual political times, a very bold president that we have with a disruptive agenda.
Bold. I like that word. Good. I like that. Okay. You're definitely a journalist.
So is the Trump presidency going to be what causes the crisis?
Well, a Trump presidency is going to be a necessary but not sufficient condition. Is that a good answer to the question?
Tell me more.
Well, meaning that other things will happen on top of it. I mean, it will be other nations too that want to push the envelope, right, on getting what they want. You have a world now in which you have a number of countries, they're dictatorships, and they all believe that the world isn't giving them anything close to their due. And that is a setup for a crisis. We had that in the 1930s, obviously, right? When much of Europe turned fascist. And you had all these countries that believed they were owed so much more than they had, right? The sense of grievance. And we certainly see that in great powers around the world today. You know, I mean, you know, you look at Iran, I mean, they want to be back to where they were. Persia was always a great empire. What happened to Persia? You know what I mean? And you go back, and it's everywhere around the world, right? Even countries that probably won't matter very much. You know, Turkey wants to be, you know, the neo-Ottomanism. They want to be like the Ottomans. Hungary wants to be back, greater Hungary. Israel wants to be greater Israel. You have it around the world today. You look at India and Narendra Modi, there's a Hindutva. You know, what could Buddhism be, you know, that's muscular and glorious? Everywhere around the world you see this. This is part of the identity politics grown large, right? We all just think we're so great. Why don't we have more? And you look at that, you know, make America great again. But you go around the world and it's every country wants to be great again. I mean, if you don't think this is a setup for conflict, I'm not sure what is.
Let's talk about timing, too. What is your best guess at this point for when this crisis will unfold?
I have no idea. I mean, I have no idea particularly, but I do think that the late 2020s and immediately beginning the 2030s is a good, I mean, you know, we have Davidson window that's closing, right? This is Admiral Davidson. He was the head of Indopac.com, you know, Indo-Pacific Command, back in 2020, and he was the one who first announced that Xi Jinping wanted to be ready for the invasion of Taiwan by 2027. Hey, 2027, it's coming right up, by the way.
Right around the corner.
But I mean, this is the closing of the Davidson window, as it's called in the military, right? And so everyone in Indopac.com, and these exercises that they have around Taiwan are becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And now the commanders of Indopac are basically saying, we can't differentiate anymore between an actual invasion and these, because these exercises now involve, you know, 1,000 ships and, you know, a tremendous number of aircraft. So I'm just saying, look, I mean, now 2027, China should be able to invade. Well, that doesn't mean not necessarily invade at that time, right? And I'm sure they're going to look at, you know, the right time. But I have no doubt that Xi Jinping regards that as absolutely essential to what he wants to do while he's still president. And he probably has one more term. I think what will be decisive for him will be any sign that the United States is more effectively tending to its national security needs. I think that will be a sign for him to go faster. Right now, if it looks like America's, I don't know, getting rid of all their missile inventory in the Mideast, that may be a sign to hold off. You know, there's the old saying, never disturb your opponent when he's busy, you know, injuring himself. But the point is that he's patient. Right, and I'm sure Putin is patient, you know, with regard to Europe. But you look at the Eastern European countries; they're terrified. For the new book I'm writing, I've been looking at some of the opinion polls now in Poland, and it's like half the polls say that, you know, they're afraid of war, and another 30% said they're really afraid of war. You know, it's that kind of thing, and they're right there, right? And they're spending like crazy on their defense. I mean, they're putting in these berms, they're putting in landmines. I mean, and if you're a Pole, you have long memories, right? Unlike Americans, we've never been occupied, invaded, right, in our entire history. And except for the South, after the World War, we have no idea what any of this means.
I want to personalize this a little bit for folks because I think one of the more interesting things about your research is that you've found that when history unfolds like this, it's driven by these recurring generational archetypes. So each generation, of course,
Yes.
is really influenced by the part of the cycle, the historical cycle they grew up in. So for instance, I'm a Gen Xer, I'm a late Gen Xer. How did the events of my upbringing influence the role that I'll play when the next crisis happens?
Well, Gen Xers, they were, throwaway kids, right? No one really cared about you.
And we're tougher for it.
And you're tougher for it. So you say
How many Gen Xers do we have out there? Okay, thank you. How many baby boomers do we have out there? Okay.
Oh, come on.
Neil's a baby boomer. What about millennials? We've got, good cohort of millennials. Do we have any Gen Z out there? All right, good. Okay, so Gen X, we're throwaways. What about the baby boomers?
So let's talk about Gen X a little
Let's
bit.
talk about Gen X.
Give them some attention, because God knows they've never had much attention. Here's another thing that's interesting about Gen X, by the way. When we coined the millennial generation, that was in 1991. That was a year before Doug Coupland's book came out called Gen X. So here's the ultimate problem. If all you Gen Xers out there don't feel abused enough already, just consider this. The generation after you is named before you were. I mean, yeah, enough said. You don't have to say anything else.
But what will we do in the reset? Because we have a specific role we'll play.
Well, you talk about Gen Xers and what defined them, everything from survivor shows, reality shows, all this stuff. And you look at, we now have a cabinet of Gen Xers, right?
Yep.
I mean, Trump's cabinet. And they're all tweeting each other like, Europe is pathetic, and it's all in capital letters, This is Gen X now running our country. And we should have seen it coming because we already knew what they were like in the 1990s. Now they're just aged into power. And they're all into, they're all into telling it brutally like it is. You look at Pete Hegseth, it's all about lethality. Let's call it the Department of War. Well, tell it like it is. You know what I mean? Don't sugarcoat it.
What about the role that the millennials will play?
Well, millennials, it's their role to bring back community. And I think on the other side of the crisis, that will be their responsibility. In fact, coming together as a community will be what they need to do to get us through this. You saw the same generational lineup, by the way, in the Great Depression and World War II. Who was the midlife generation, the hard knocks generation that sort of led the troops in World War II? The George Pattons, the Omar Bradleys, they were all part of the lost generation, which was also a throwaway generation, right? It was back when kids were run over by streetcars. No one really cared. We had a huge wave of child protective legislation that came in right around 1910. And we had this huge wave of construction of schools in America, particularly high schools. That was all for the new GI generation. They were just too young to serve in World War I. The lost generation, they were the World War I type. The Hemingway, Fitzgerald, right. Those came after. They were much more idealistic. They believed much more in community. They voted overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party after the crash. They were the first generation of African Americans to vote for the Democratic Party, no longer for the Republican. Obviously, African Americans always voted for the Republican, but it was the party of Lincoln after all, right? So this was a huge shift. And it was very much the generation that represented the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organization, the new wave of unionization, the GI Bill, the increasing community orientation of the New Deal that came out of World War II that rewarded that generation. I mean, it gave them subsidized housing, it gave them subsidies to go to college, to go to vocational school. This is going to be a very different environment, right? They were the generation that took us through the crisis, that we succeeded. We got out of there very successfully. And they were the generation that was rewarded. No one really rewarded the lost generation. As I remember, Truman left the White House. He didn't even have a pension back then. He rode his old jalopy back to Missouri. He was really worried about his future. And back then, the ex-presidents didn't lend their names to, meme coins and stuff. It was a very different era.
I want to talk a little bit more about the future because, in reading your work, it does seem like there's a reason for optimism for the future as much as there's some dire aspects to what could happen in the next couple of years. How will the country be better off after this turning?
Community. That's number one. Much less inequality. Inequality always goes down after a fourth turning. That's one of the cardinal traits. And by the way, in our first turning, the late 1940s, 1950s, you saw an enormous reduction in the Gini coefficient in America. I mean, it started going down in the 1930s a little bit. Rich people were getting wiped out. It went down much more during World War II, largely due to inflation, which wiped out all the bondholders, right? And then we had a much stronger middle class. It actually didn't reach its nadir until the late 1960s when boomers are coming of age. So when boomers are coming of age, it was maximum equality in America. That's when the middle class was huge. I think I mentioned at the beginning of this that boomers hated the middle class because it was so strong. It was all Pleasant Valley Sunday, charcoal burning everywhere. I mean, this is the kind of the lyrics that boomers remember. So they wanted to steer the country in a different direction, and they succeeded, right? So that is going to change. I think authority will change. People will actually follow authority. They always do after a great crisis. Yeah. And you remember in the late 40s and 50s, I mean, amazingly, everyone wanted to do what the doctor in the white coat told them to do. So that will come back, as well as a new focus on the long term. I think the other thing that characterized, if you look after the Civil War, during and just after the Civil War, we made these huge long-term investments. We built things like the Brooklyn Bridge and the Transcontinental Railroad and all that. And we made these enormous investments in waterworks and various long-term investments. You find the same thing after World War II, where we were so engaged with enormous long-term infrastructure. We're going to do the same thing. I would say today we are a very present-focused. Obviously, I mean, look at the deficit. Look at America's net indebtedness to foreigners. It's about 100% of GDP. Either our federal debt or our indebtedness to foreigners, and we're running up the tab really fast right now. And the point is, this is completely unsustainable. Most Americans hate it. They don't understand why our political system can't give us anything better. But that changes. That changes. Right now, the reason no one's doing anything better, I'll tell you why. It's because right now, the only thing that matters is winning for the two political tribes. And you can see in our two political tribes how we're relearning community. This is where we're learning community. Red zone, blue zone. And I better get to the voting booth. We have the highest voter participation rates in America today than we've had in 100 years.
But in a lot of ways, that's a good thing.
It's a good thing, and it shows we've become more tribal. If I don't vote, there's not going to be in America anymore because the other side's going to win. That's how everyone feels. We're already in that community conflict mode that I talked about right now domestically in America. I mean, look at this gerrymander fight. Pretty soon, if this goes on for a couple of years, and we've seen this recent, the Voting Rights Act was limited, right? We see what that's going to do down in the South. We're going to have we're going to have no Democrats from the South. We're going to have no Republicans from the Northeast or the West Coast. So Congress has become even more regional than the country as a whole. And the country as a whole is self-sorting into red and blue camps.
It certainly is. I know people have questions, so I want to take a minute to go to the audience. Are there questions? Right there.
With all the doomsday scenarios that you just laid out for us, thank you. What's in your portfolio? Like, where are you investing?
Yeah.
They're not doomsday. We just heard that. All the ways in which this country is going to get better on the other side. By the way, I'll get to the portfolio in just a second, but but I do want to say, when we came out with the fourth turning in 1997, and that was kind of, late in the Clinton era. We were coming out of the Asian flu, and things are looking better, right? And everyone said, oh, it's such a doom and gloom book. We're going to have all this huge crisis out there. This recent book I did, The Fourth Turning Is Here, which came out in 2023, the opposite reaction for readers. You actually think there's something good on the other side? What makes you so rosy? Why are you so optimistic? And I think that's important, because when you think of fourth turning, what I'm talking about is being gloomy. Let me ask you all this. What can be as gloomy as an indefinite continuation of the trends you see today in American society? People growing ever more hopeless, the division between haves and have-nots becoming ever greater, people thinking increasingly that America is just a name, it doesn't exist as a national community. What could be more gloom? I mean, that is the ultimate gloom. Just take current trends, put them on extension indefinitely, and this is why cyclical dynamics in history are actually a good thing, right?
So tell us about the portfolio.
Look, part of it is we expect the next 10 years to obviously be very different from the last 40. And that already distinguishes us from probably 98% of other ETFs that are out there, right? But obviously, we tend to be, at least in the long equity part of our portfolio, we're long in the kinds of things that people are avoiding right now. This is infrastructure, industrials, defense, sort of national security, personal security, all of those themes are big. Energy, obviously, that's a good one to have right now. And I think the other aspect of it is because fourth turnings always climax with inflation, every case it's occurred. And here's the thing to remember about inflation. When your country is in danger and you need to move resources really fast because of present danger, inflation is not a problem, it's a solution. And I think we have to remember historically, we've had huge inflation every one of these crises in the past. And that's partly how we finance things. And it's partly how you take from the people who have and give to the new, you're right, you got industries to finance, you got soldiers to pay for, whatever's happening, you need to get them resources now. Well, you just inflate, and the last time I looked, most government bonds were not indexed. Boom, that's a solution. You see what I mean? So we are not long in bonds, certainly non-indexed bonds. So we generally tend to be short in bonds, and what in our portfolio takes the place of the 60-40 equity bond mix is commodities and commodity futures. And since we started the fund around Thanksgiving, that's also done very well. So that's and we do think that's a great long-term positioning. I would say in addition, we also have some through derivatives, we do some tail hedging on the downside, in case when you wake up one of these days, the market's down by 10%. We tend to be a little bit protected that way. Most funds aren't. I don't know if that's a quick overview.
It is, and unfortunately we ran out of time for more questions, but I'll end it on this. What other reason, in a nutshell, what other reason do you see to be optimistic about the future in America? I'm incredibly optimistic in America. I just think, here's the thing, that everyone looks around and they say, these autocrats do so well. These autocrats have long-term future. These autocrats, whatever they want, they can do. You know what I mean? And democracy, we seem so helpless, we seem so befuddled and so on. But I'll tell you that in a crisis, I would rather be in a democracy like America than any other country. Democracies excel in crises. Why? Because an autocrat has to look at two things. They have to look at their enemy, they have to look at their own people at the same time, and they're not sure which to be more afraid of, right? A democracy, everyone is on the same page, and they rise to the occasion. And this is what I meant. You could look at so many examples through history
But a good example would be in World War II. Interestingly, Germany and many of the Axis powers, Germany is a great example, didn't go into wartime mobilization when it came to production until the fall of 1943. And the war was practically over by then. It was too late. Why? Because Hitler didn't dare ramp up production too much because he was afraid of what the German people might think. In Britain, they went on 24/7 production of, you know, the Spitfires and the Hurricanes at the beginning of 1940, and they never stopped. In other words, they were totally on board because they were a democracy. We forget that democracies have hidden powers, and they excel in a crisis.